Hi you guys, and welcome back to another true crime and makeup time video. If you're new here, my name is Zara and I post a new true crime video every single week. So if you love makeup and you love true crime, definitely think about hitting that subscribe button, guys. It would mean so much to me. So today's case is one that I actually saw years ago, and I think I saw it on the Oprah Winfrey show. And I don't know, it just always stuck with me, and I remember watching it and I remember thinking about it. And just thinking how can one human being treat another person this way? It's a case on domestic abuse and assault in a marriage. It's very sickening, but also makes you wonder how these situations come about to take place. How is a woman able to suffer for so long when the abuse comes from not only her husband, but also her children? Let's talk about Susan Still. So Susan Still, she was born in 1964 in New York in just a middle-class family. She attended college in Buffalo, New York. She was an 18-year-old student when she met and fell in love with a rising blues guitarist whose name was Ulner Still in 1982. Ulner was older than her at the time. He was 26. But they dated for years before they actually got married and walked down the aisle. And she says although she felt that Ulner was overprotective and controlling at times, she felt like he was the love of her life. They married years and years later in 1992, and they ended up having 3 children, 2 boys and 1 girl. Susan was actually the one supporting the family financially, and she worked at a health insurance company. At first, Ulner, her husband, he was controlling, but he wasn't particularly violent or physical in their relationship. He actually reminded Susan a lot of her own father, but the more that Susan actually complied with his requests, the more that Ulner would demand. According to Susan, he had a will to dominate and the power to brainwash her. Ulner eventually isolated Susan even from her own family. He told her her family didn't care about her. However, due to Ulner's manipulation and control, which gradually increased, Susan was slow in a sense to realize to what extent her husband's domineering ways were going to affect her. Susan, like a lot of women in her situation, believed that her husband behaved this way because he really cared about her and he loved her. He was doing all these things to teach her how to be a better wife, a better mother, a better person. After giving birth to all 3 children, Susan then had to stay at home and look after the children. And once they were married, Susan says that that's when things really began to escalate in the home. Susan says her husband began abusing her physically and verbally every single day of their life. And he would do this even in front of 3 children. Often, Susan says that Ulner would make audio recordings of his abuse against Susan so he could go back later and listen to it again. For years, Ulner told her, she was stupid, alienated her from her family, and then told her she was a bad mother. And she says there were times where she absolutely believed she was stupid. She believed him. And there were times where he absolutely had her convinced that she was a terrible mother. Then, after 10 years of being married, the abuse took a violent turn. For the last 2 years of her marriage to Ulner, Susan says that the beatings became super regular. She says that anything could set him off. She said when you're in that type of life, in that type of relationship, it's hard to even make decisions on everyday life. It's hard for you to even walk across the room and make sure that you're walking across the room in the right way because you don't want to set him off. Susan often wonders how she even let that woman get to that state, how she ended up in that way, literally to the point where she was abused nearly every day of her marriage. She says one day she just found herself in a marriage that escalated from controlling to extremely violent. And that's how she claims she became a victim of domestic violence. According to the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, approximately 5.3 incidents of intimate partner assaults take place in the US every year. And it's probably more at this point, I guess. Especially with COVID, I think that number really increased. Susan states that the control was absolutely there from the beginning, but she just failed to recognize it. And the physical abuse only started like the serious physical, in her words, the serious physical abuse only started 10 years into the marriage. And it started actually because of something so stupid. She forgot an item at the grocery store, something that he wanted, and he hurt her pretty badly. And she says like when it first happened, she couldn't even believe it was happening. Like she was like outside her body watching it happen going, I can't believe this is even happening, you know? She also said prior to this, she accepted his controlling behavior by convincing herself it wasn't that bad. And she would actually watch other women on TV, like being abused. And she would be like, why is that woman even with that man? Like she didn't get that she was in the exact same situation. Because she said up until Ulner actually started hitting her, she didn't believe that she was in a abusive relationship. In 2002, the family actually began struggling financially, and that's when Susan returned to work and she got a new job. And at this point, she had to call him when she moved from one place to another. So for example, when she got to work, she would drive there. She gets to work, she'd have to call him and be like, okay, I got to work. Then when she finishes work and she's going to pick up her sons from school, she'd call him and be like, okay, I'm leaving work. I'm about to pick up the kids. Then she gets to the kids' school. She's like, okay, I'm at the kids' school. I'm about to pick them up. Then once she picks up the kids, she's like, okay, I picked up the kids and now like I've got them in the car. That is exhausting to have to do that. Let alone have to do this multiple times a day. Like every movement, if you're going to lunch, I'm going to lunch. Like crazy. Even during the really abusive parts of her marriage, Susan would just hope and like long for the days that it would return back to normal. She says, as a victim, you get to this point where your abuser does something to totally overpower you, but they're so good at what they're doing that you believe that it's your fault. You are brainwashed to believe that you are the problem. And the crazy thing is that they don't actually enter the relationship this way. Most abusers don't just begin abusing you from the start because you would leave, right? They come in as a really great person. They give you great memories, great times. And then as a victim, all you do is remember the good times. You remember that those times existed. So you're like, what can I do to fix myself to make sure we can go back to those good times, you know? It's actually really sad. The only escape that Susan really had was her boss. Her name was Lynn Jasper, and Lynn and Susan became good friends because they would just share stories about their kids and their lives. And when Lynn was questioned, she stated that if like no one said anything, she would have actually believed that their marriage was like super rock solid. Shortly thereafter, Lynn said she was horrified to hear, overhear a conversation between Susan and Ulner. And in this conversation, she heard Susan referring to Ulner as master. Like, can you imagine having to call your husband that? I would rather die, like for real. She would be like, yes, master, no, master. Like, it was really obvious. And Lynn says like the first couple times she heard it, she thought like, wow, what a sick individual. But then you get to hear, you know, Susan's version of events and you can hear that it wasn't Susan's choice to do that. It wasn't out of love and friendship towards Ulner. It was more out of fear and dedication. Lynn knew something was wrong, so she began collecting clues and taking notes of any weird incidents in her notebook. She would record behavioral changes and any like visible injuries, marks on her body. And in one of her entries, she wrote on May 6th, 2003, she wrote, "Talk to Susan regarding head wound." Because at the time there was like a visible head wound, like head injury on Susan's forehead. And Lynn asked Susan, like, you know, what happened? What's that mark from? And Susan was like, oh, I was pulling down a box like from my closet and it bumped me on the head and then it hit me in the eye. And Lynn was like, okay. And she just like listened to Susan for that moment, but she didn't really believe her. And if you watch any of Susan's interviews or when you find out what I'm about to tell you, she seems like such a sweet woman that like you can just imagine her being abused by this asshole and like how she just took it. And I just feel so sorry for her because she honestly has like the sweetest voice and she's so timid. And yeah, I just feel really bad for her. At this stage, the physical violence between that Ulner inflicted on Susan just began to get gradually closer and closer in date in Lynn's diary. And Lynn says, as the markings in my diary got closer and closer together, I realized I wasn't making a mountain out of a molehill. On May 23rd, 2003, Susan arrived to work with like a bunch of makeup on, and it was in an attempt to cover up her bruising. Lynn immediately noticed this massive bruise on her face that she had obviously gotten from a beating. So Lynn finally decides to confront Susan, and she says to Susan, I think there's something that you want to tell me, and I just want you to know that it's totally okay that you tell me this. And, you know, that's all it took for Susan to just tell her everything. And Susan was just crying and venting and just saying like, look, this is what's happening to me. And Lynn says, you know, she took her into this private room, closed the blinds and just listened to her. But she knew what Susan was telling her was not even the full extent and the full story of everything that had been happening. Soon after, and I'm guessing this is because the violence was escalating, Lynn finds this letter in her drawer from Susan. And the letter read as follows. It said, if anything should happen to me or if I should turn up missing, it is possible my husband wasn't involved. I love you so much, my children. Please forgive me for the things you have seen in your young life. Know you were loved by your mother. This was like essentially a final warning or farewell in case something worse happened to Susan. So Lynn was so upset by this that she was like, no. So she just told the police. She's like, I have to let the police know what's going on. Susan, at the time of, you know, writing this letter, she said she was so beaten down, so broken mentally, physically, that he made her feel that she was no better than the piece of leather on his shoe. The two of them, Lynn and Susan, even developed this code word that if Susan didn't come into work and, you know, Lynn would call the home and check on Susan, and if Susan was the one to answer the phone, they had this code word that they could use to be like, call the police, something's not right. So Lynn was really Susan's savior in this whole situation. Now, a month after this, Susan just really hit her breaking point. Now, it was the day that Ulner instructed their 13-year-old son to videotape, make a recording of the abuse he was about to inflict on his wife. One Sunday afternoon in 2003, Susan says that her husband became enraged when she offered to make him a sandwich for lunch. Yeah. And you can watch the tape. Like you can't watch the whole tape. You can watch like clips of the tape on Oprah, I think it is. And basically what's happening is that I think she makes a sandwich for her son and then she brings it up like upstairs. They have like an upstairs living area. She brings it up to the upstairs living area and she gives it to her son. And then I think Ulner's like, what about my sandwich? And like he loses it. So then she offers to make him a sandwich, but then he's like, now, you know, I'm not going to take a sandwich from you now. Like he gets pissed. So he goes looking for his audio recorder, something that he had normally recorded the assault on. Remember I was saying before, like when he would verbally assault her, he would grab this audio recorder and like make sure he was recording it so he could play it back later and I don't know, get off on it. So he couldn't find the audio recorder at that time. And Susan's son was like, well, like he was in the room at the time. Both of her sons were in the room at the time. Her daughter wasn't. And when he couldn't find this audio recorder, one of the sons, I think it was a 13-year-old son, he said, well, Dad, there's a video camera right there. Why don't you use that? So that was the next best thing. So he hands the video camera to his 13-year-old son and he says, here, record this bitch, basically. So what resulted was over 51 minutes of verbal and physical abuse on Susan. And her older son, the 13-year-old boy, was videoing everything. And her 8-year-old son was sitting there on the couch, like just watching everything unfold. During the first 40 minutes of this video, Ulner is just standing there, literally just screaming at her, calling her all these sorts of names, basically saying she's worth nothing, like literally saying the cruelest things. And throughout the whole time, he's like threatening her with physical violence. Some of the things that he says, I wrote it down. So he says things like, you play those stupid games with me, I'll knock the teeth out of your face. I'm going to knock your head across that wall. And yeah, he was saying this to her as her sons were standing there watching. At first, like you can see Susan, she's dressed in like a sweatshirt and track pants, and like it's so upsetting to watch the video. I remember the first time I saw it, like it brought me to tears. But she looks so timid, so afraid of him, and she's just standing in front of him like with her head bowed and just taking it. She said looking back, she was trying to think of a way to calm him down, really. So she says her mind was racing, trying to just figure out the right thing to say to calm him down. Find the answer about the freaking sandwich that was going to make him happy, going to appease him in that moment so that he wouldn't start physically beating her. Nothing, she says, works. After 40 minutes of this, Ulner then begins to punch, slap, and kick his wife. And he does this for the final 10 minutes of this video. He throws her around the room. There's like a bed up there too. Like, I think it's like a bed. And he like, the way he's like, it's like so upsetting. The way he has her on the bed, it's like she's half off the bed. And he's like dominating her on top of her. And he's like, you've been taught what to say to me, heifer. Like demanding her obedience to him. And he's like, you follow what I say to the T. It's, wow. So in under an hour, he calls her like stupid 23 times. And I think he calls her a heifer like over 28 times. Then after the camera stops rolling, Ulner then sends his eldest son to go to the kitchen and get ice for his mother. Susan then says she just goes, takes a shower, and just goes ahead and continues to do laundry and other like household chores. And that's literally how she just spent the rest of her day. Now, I told you that her older son was recording everything, but what I didn't tell you is that he is also heard partaking in the abuse. So during the verbal and physical assaults, her son is heard like supporting his father's statements. And Susan believes that this is because over the years, Ulner had brainwashed the kids, all three of them, and he forced them to participate in the abuse on their own mother. On one occasion, Susan says that she said something to Ulner that made him so angry that he demanded everyone in the family come together and, have a family meeting. And he made all the kids call their own mother a white hoe slut. And he wanted them to like chant it and all three of them say it together. He would tell them when to start and then tell them when to repeat it. And in her mind, she was like, that's not what I am. That's not what I am. How can you make my own children do this to me? And the very fact that Susan was even saying something like this, like, what do you mean that's not what you are? Of course you're not a white hoe slut. Like the fact that they can mess with you so much to the point where you even would say something like that. Does that make sense? Like, why would you even say like, I'm not a white hoe slut? It's like, of course you're not. You've been with this man since you were 18. And I don't know, even if you were, you know what I'm trying to say? Like, it's just crazy. And then to attack his wife racially, the wife that he chose to marry, like he's black, but she's white. So she's a white hoe slut. Wow. Like, what a name. Susan says that she was devastated by her children's actions, but she understands why they did it. She knew that her children needed to do what they needed to do to survive. And if that meant that they had to side with that monster, their father, then that's what they had to do. The same day that video was shot, Susan says that that's when she made this fateful decision. As she was sitting in the room with her oldest son, he looks at his oldest son and he points to Susan and he says, you see that? That's the road you're headed down if you don't straighten up. And I'm guessing that maybe her son had done something or, made Ulner upset. So with that comment, Susan was like, wow, he could possibly kill me one day. And with that realization, she was just like, I have to leave. So later that night, if, everything I've said is not already horrible, later that night, Ulner gets that video that was shot, that 51-minute video, and he plays it for the entire family to sit down and watch, the kids to watch. This had now become an instructional video to teach his children about the flaws that their mother had. Like, I'm not even making this up. This really, really happened. Like, when the son was interviewed, when one of the sons was interviewed, he said the whole family had to sit down and watch. And then his dad would stop and pause it and be like, do you see right there? Do you see the mistake she made right there? Do you see how she made me do this to her? Do you see how she made me hit her? Like, blaming everything, blaming his actions completely on Susan. Susan at this point was like, all right, I got to get my kids away from Ulner and myself away from Ulner. The next day, Susan goes to work and Lynn says like the markings and beatings and bruises on her were worse than like the worst they've ever been. So Lynn says to Susan like, Susan, it's got to stop. Today's the day. And then Susan responds to Lynn, today's the day. So Lynn calls the police. The police come to the job, to the workplace. They take pictures of Susan, all the markings, all the beatings. And now it was time for them to develop a plan. They had, Susan and the kids had nowhere to go and they needed to figure out what they were going to do. And during this point, Susan actually already fled with the kids. Like she left when the police were doing like their due diligence, basically. During this time, Ulner is calling Susan repeatedly, like, where are you? Oh, and sorry, she only had the 2 boys. She didn't have the daughter because the daughter was older. And Ulner was spending this entire time like trying to track her down. Because remember, normally she had to call and like tell him exactly where she was at all times. And during this time when Ulner was calling her, police began to record his phone calls. And on one of these phone calls, he screams at her, if you don't bring my sons home right now, I'm going to kill you. Like a full threat. He fully threatened her right then and there. The police heard everything. Now, Susan's oldest daughter or oldest kid, she was the daughter, she chose to side with her father and chose to go and return home to be with her father, while the sons fled with the mother. And with the help of the, police department, Susan and her 2 sons entered a women's shelter. Now, after years of abusing his wife, Ulner was finally arrested and Susan headed to court to go and face her abuser, the man she loved. And at the trial, Ulner's behavior is shocking. Like some of the videos I've watched, he is unbelievable. And the prosecutor even said, like, it was a woman. She said, I have never seen that, like somebody that arrogant. She's never seen that much arrogance in her life. He was making eye contact with the female jurors and trying to flirt and like acting like a king. And he thought he could control them the same way he controlled Susan. When he was interviewed by the probation department, he blamed Susan for where he was. Like, this is Susan's fault that I've been arrested. Susan's fault that I'm facing trial. And the judge even said to him, you still don't get it. You have destroyed these children. You have destroyed this woman. And Ulner was just not remorseful for any of it. Now, in, her closing arguments, the prosecutor, she played the videotape, the 51 minutes for the jury. And she says to the jury, Ulner in this video keeps telling Susan, I have to teach you. I have to teach you how to obey me. I have to teach you how to be a better woman. I have to teach you. What I want from you now is to teach him. And I was like, wow, that is so powerful. Like, it just made me like so happy because as a woman especially, like, I'm sure she got some kind of like, she must have felt something knowing that, this jury was hopefully about to convict his ass, Now, the prosecutor, she emphasizes that while the 51 minutes of video evidence, was great evidence and it shows the horrific side of abuse, it actually wasn't the most important piece of evidence because that video shows one assault, like a misdemeanor assault that I think is like punishable by up to just 1 year in prison. He can get out after that 1 year and kill her. She, in fact, states you don't need a videotape. You need to document your injuries over time. Like, she's not saying sit there and, take the injuries and just let them accumulate over all these years. She's saying every time it happens, like, document it. Now, Susan didn't keep records of her abuse, but luckily her boss, Lynn, did. Remember that notebook? She kept it all. When Lynn began noticing signs of abuse in Susan, she didn't want to she wanted to make sure that she wasn't overreacting. So she started making notes in her calendar every time a new bruise popped up or, things like that. The appearances of abuse, Susan acting withdrawn, coming in, late to work with a black eye, or even if she was like frequently absent from work, she would make notes of all of that. And one of the huge signs for Lynn was when Ulner actually went out of town, and during those days that he was out of town, Susan was like a different woman, a completely different woman. She was acting, free and comfortable in herself, in her life. Now, both brothers, Dane, who was 13, and Dasman, who was 9, testified against their father at the trial, and they stated that they did witness abuse against their mother at the hands of their father. Dane testified to seeing his father whip his mother with a belt, and then he confessed that he was the one to videotape that 51-minute beating. Desmond, however, offered up like the most compelling testimony. He was really sad throughout the whole thing, crying, because he would talk about how his mother was behaving and crying every time his dad beat her up. Now, their older daughter, Angel, she was 22 years old at the time of the trial. She was a pharmacy technician, but she actually dropped out of university to go and support her father in trial. And she testified for her father during the trial, so against her mother. And unfortunately, she denied ever witnessing a single instance of abuse at the hands of her father towards her mother. And she said she never saw any markings or bruises on her mother ever, even though there was like photos of it, you know, like clearly she was brainwashed. Angel actually said, "We had the Cosby household. That's the only way I could ever describe it." I'm sure her father told her to say that. When, you know, she was shown pictures of her mother's bruises, she was like, "Oh, my mom did that to herself." And she said that 51-minute video where he beat, you know, her mother, she said he was actually on a drug called Dramamine, which was an over-the-counter drug used to treat motion sickness. So like, what's he motion sick from? His hands beating up his mom? Like, that doesn't make any sense, but that was her testimony. Now, Ulner also apparently got a really stiff sentence because not only did he beat Susan with his hands, he would use items like belts and books and things like that. So those dangerous like instruments make it a felony, which is weird. Like, your hands are still dangerous, but that was the law. So even though the video proved a single act of violence, the Lynn's diary actually served as the rest of the evidence. So armed with Susan's and her son's testimony, the video, Lynn's diary, and Lynn's testimony, the prosecution charged Ulner with 12 separate counts of assault. So did the jury teach Ulner the same way that, you know, Ulner wanted to teach Susan? Well, they did, finding him guilty on 12 counts of assault and 2 counts of endangering the welfare of a child. The judge sentenced him to 36 years in prison. And this was reportedly the longest sentence ever handed out to an offender where the victim wasn't killed. He wasn't eligible for parole until this year, 2022, but I don't think he's out as yet, and I don't think he will be. So now, years later, Susan is moving on with her life, living her life, you know, with her sons. She says that they continue to grow. They're in a much better place now. Her boys are doing well despite the painful memories. They're growing up. I mean, they've grown up a lot by now. And her children will always have to deal with what happened in that home. Those visual memories are never going to go away, but they can learn to grow from it because their mom fought for them. They began therapy, including their daughter, who joined them for counseling. And Susan says that the relationship between her daughter and, you know, her sons, everything, they're all making great strides and they're all trying to build their family back up. She says that they were basically putting their family back together years after Ulner's arrest, after what he had done to the family, because I can understand if the children were so manipulated, they would now feel that their mother has done something wrong by making their father pay for what he did. It's like wild to me that the daughter chose to go live with the father, like seeing that her father was abusing the mother in terms of like just genders and stuff like that. Your mother is everything to you, you know, she's the one that does everything for you. It doesn't seem like Ulner ever did anything for the kids except control everything. I feel the daughter must have been terrified of her father, maybe that she would be next because look how he's treating a woman. So maybe she would be next, so that's why she cited him. Today, Susan is actually known and recognized as a speaker against domestic violence. She has appeared in a couple TV shows at this point, and she's very close with her children again. And she believes that counseling is essential, you know, to coping with these kinds of situations. Susan and Lynn, her former boss, they still remain really close friends. Susan continues to spread domestic violence awareness and uses her abuse video at police academies as a tool to sort of like put a face to the epidemic. She also hopes to start a foundation to help children from domestic violence households. A family violence center named its Courage to Change award to Susan. I forgot what I was saying. And this is an award that we awarded annually to a victim and survivor of domestic violence. Susan now knows that Ulner would have never changed. She had that belief and hope that, you know, maybe he was going to change and be the man he once was in the early days of their relationship, but she realizes now that it was never ever going to happen. And she says that she's proud of the woman she has become. And when she thinks about that woman on the tape, she refers to her as she, like she doesn't connect it to being her today. She makes the statement, she's a different person to me, but she's very much still a part of this person right here. I look at her and I think, how could you have let yourself get to that state? How could you have let this happen to you? But I know how I did. So I guess that she's a different person to me now. But I know that she's here and she's helped me become who I am today. So, I mean, imagine watching yourself in a video and not even recognizing yourself. So she says that till this day, she's still afraid of when her husband actually is going to be released from prison and what he's going to do to her. But she says she just focuses on her mission, spreading awareness about domestic violence, trying to help people. In relation to the kids, I actually do feel sorry for them. I feel like the kids are going to cop a lot of hate for supporting the father. I think it's just something we would not understand unless you're in those shoes. We don't know how scared they were. We don't know how brainwashed they were. We don't know if they did it to prevent themselves getting beat. I mean, personally, I love my mom so much. Like I could never, why am I getting emotional? I could never ever like watch her. Oh my gosh. I could never ever watch her being abused that badly and just stand there and take it. Like the type of person I am, I know that I'd probably step in and I'd probably get beat too. But that's also because I wasn't raised to believe that it's okay for this to happen to another woman, let alone someone in my family, let alone my mom. You know, the woman that raised me, the woman that takes care of me. Like it's so messed up. So the fact that both sons testified against their father in the trial and they did so through tears, I feel like it says something. Dasman, the younger son, also recounts one time. He says that, you know, his mom wasn't home and they were all sitting around the dining table and it was, you know, his brother, his sister, his dad, and they were all having a really, really good time without their mom. So he remembers when his mom came home from work that the vibe of the house and the situation and everything just changed. And he says that everyone gave, you know, his mom such a dark look that he just felt horrible about it, and that's something he will forever feel bad about. And it was more so the fact that he's like, I felt like the household was better without my mom in it. And it's just this guilt that he holds on to. You know what I mean? Like, it's not his mom's fault, but essentially when he feels like, okay, well, the household's so much better without her. My dad's calm, like everyone's happy. There's no fighting, yelling. And, you know, as soon as my mom comes home, it's like my dad changes. And instead of blaming the dad, you blame your mom. And if you really think about this statement, why did he feel that way? It has nothing to do with his mother, really. It has everything to do with his father. How his father would react to Susan coming home. How he would assert dominance and choose violence and choose for his family to be living like that. It's not like Susan would come home and be like, please beat me today. Please get angry. Please, let's have a fight. I think that just shows you the manipulative ways of this man and how he made his kids think that their own mother was the problem. The one that he was choosing to implicate pain, hurt, and physical violence on. Abuse comes in many forms, yet it doesn't have to be as violent as this video, for example, or for it to be this type of situation for it to still be destructive. Sometimes the abuse is just emotional control and isolation from family, from your friends. Other times it consists of name calling, humiliation, financial control, or threats of violence. Physical abuse is the most commonly experienced type of abuse, but it can come in many forms, you know, like emotional, financial, or even sexual abuse. Recognizing the signs of abuse, especially when physical abuse is lacking, it's not easy, especially for those even being abused. So if you know anyone or if you're in that situation, don't wait too long before you get some help. Don't wait till it's too late. So I will leave some like domestic violence hotline numbers down in the description. I think I will leave it for the US and Australia. And if you guys have the correct domestic violence hotline numbers for your country, feel free to leave them in the comments below. So you never know who could be reading it. And yeah, that's the end of today's video, guys. I hope you found this one interesting. And let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. And I will see you in the next one, guys. Besitos. Bye.